All right, thanks Marco and Fabrizio for organizing this and inviting me to this seminar. And the first thing I should say is that the proper title is a patchwork approach to the concept of neural function, and unfortunately in the manuscript I didn't include that, but it should become very clear it's about the concept of neural function. And this project is a core theme of my dissertation on exploratory concept formation and non-cognitive functions, with the tweetable title, Meeting the Brain on Its Own Terms. So I'm interested in the question how neuroscientists conceptualize neural functions. Oh, I just did something that I didn't want to do. Hold on. No. Okay. And that question has a descriptive and a normative component. So the descriptive component is how do neuroscientists actually conceptualize function in practice, and the normative component is how they should conceptualize the concept of neural function. So let's begin with the descriptive test. I will consider some general quotes here to give sort of a flavor how neuroscientists often conceptualize function. Okay, there you go. Okay, so Marcel Mesulam writes a major task of the CNS, the central nervous system, is to configure the way in which sensory information is linked to adaptive responses and meaningful experiences. In their neuroscientific textbook, Principles of Neuroscience, Eric Kandel and co-authors write that today it is possible to link the molecular dynamics of individual nerve cells to representations of perceptual and motor acts in the brain, and to relate these internal mechanisms to observable behavior. And finally, the molecular neurobiologist of memory, Stevens, writes that the dream of neurobiology is to understand all aspects of interesting and important cognitive phenomena like memory from the underlying molecular mechanisms through behavior. And if we look at some of the keywords here, such as information, behavior, and cognitive, we see that oftentimes neuroscientists conceptualize neural functions in terms of cognition. And the core thesis of my talk today and this paper is that if we conceptualize neural function only in terms of cognition, we risk cognitive myopia. So we risk looking at neural function only through the lens of cognition. And cognitive myopia can be defined as the following. A given description is an instance of neural function if and only if it characterizes a set of neural entities and activities as processing information that directly contributes to one or several cognitive and behavioral capacities of the organism. And cognitive, so this is a sort of like a more formal definition, but cognitive myopia, as I see it, is more of an implicit tendency of both neuroscientists and philosophers to look at predominantly or even exclusively cognitive neural functions. And this sort of is the intuition behind that it's certainly true that the central nervous system underlies or is implicated in every cognitive and behavioral capacities of an organism. But cognitive myopia goes from that assumption to the implicit conclusion that everything the central nervous system does is directly linked to cognition and behavior. And it is this sort of conclusion that I think is wrong and that we should try to avoid. And I think it is wrong because there are clearly neural functions that do not have a direct cognitive role. So here are some initial examples. The brain controls basic functions like breathing. It produces energy for metabolism to run, fuel various kinds of functions, and it keeps itself and the body in a homeostatic equilibrium. So it prevents the decay of the organism or the disintegration of the organism over time. And because cognitive myopia only focuses on these cognitive functions, it overlooks these, what I call non-cognitive neural functions, such as the ones listed here. And so you need to know what sort of these non-cognitive functions are. So I define them as neural entities and activities that first do not directly contribute to behavior and cognition by processing behaviorally relevant information, and because they contribute instead to the structural integrity and homeostatic equilibrium by maintaining and repairing neural systems in the central nervous system or other systems within the body. And cognitive myopia overlooks these non-cognitive functions because it can hinder the research on these functions in at least 3 ways. So the first way is because these functions fulfill this first condition, that they don't process behaviorally relevant information, that cognitive myopia leads to researchers to simply neglect these non-cognitive functions. That would be sort of the first kind of problem. It can also lead them to acknowledge these functions, but try to shoehorn them into cognitive vocabulary. So to try to characterize them in cognitive terms, although they fulfill this first condition and although they contribute to maintain and repair the brain and body. And so this would be more of a conceptual mistake to do that, or would be conceptually inadequate, descriptively inadequate. Whereas the third option would have more of a negative evaluative character. So if neuroscientists discover these neural entities and activities that don't have cognitive roles, they may discard them as epiphenomena or noise. And sort of in my historical research on functional concepts or research on neural functions, I found several examples where this happens. So for instance, research on gamma oscillations discarded these as epiphenomena that are not relevant for visual processing in the early 90s, whereas some other researchers argued that they have cognitive roles. And in early neuroimaging research, researchers also characterized task-unrelated changes in the signal as noise. And by now, if you followed neuroimaging in the last decade or so, you may know that there's now a field called resting state research that looks exactly at this type of signal and thinks that it's actually not noise, but it's functionally significant in one way or another. Cognitive myopia hinders in neuroscience and philosophy because it prevents researchers to try to explain how cognitive functions are enabled by these non-cognitive functions. So, for instance, from brain metabolism, we know that activity that's induced by a cognitive task only presents a small percentage of the energy that the brain is using. And obviously there's a lot more energy used for all kinds of processes, some cognitive and others I would argue non-cognitive. And these non-cognitive processes have to be there in the first place to enable this information processing and these adaptive responses to the environment. And because cognitively myopic researchers only focus on cognitive functions, they do not explain how this information processing fits into this broader physiological context of the brain as a biological organ. Cognitive myopia also affects philosophy of neuroscience because oftentimes philosophers only discuss research on neural functions in terms of cognitive function. So, for instance, research on how neuroscientists localize and decompose functions often look at examples from the history of neuroscience where neuropsychologists or electrophysiologists try to localize cognitive functions such as perception, vision, auditory processing, or attention or memory functions. And this seems to suggest that successful localization and decomposition characterizes the cognitive functions of neural structures, and there's no discussion usually, or not a little discussion usually, of other types of function and how they are localized and decomposed. Also, there's been quite some literature on explanation, and these two quotes that I presented to you in the beginning are used by these two accounts to defend different accounts of neuroscientific explanation. So John Bickel uses this quote by Eric Kandel to argue that neuroscientific explanations of cognitive phenomena are primarily reductive, and he uses examples such as memory or I think memory and eye control to argue for this claim. And Carl Craver uses this quote by Stevens to argue that these explanations are multi-level. And again, here the focus is usually on cognitive functions. Also, there has been some recent literature on resting state research that I just mentioned, neuroimaging research. And here, typically authors look at the role of resting state research for revising cognitive architectures, that's the paper by Bechtel, or the role for resting state fMRI to characterize long-term mental processes. Also, another topic in recent years has been the topic of that many structures in the nervous system seems to subserve multiple functions, and here multifunctionality is usually equated with cognitive multifunctionality. And so these sort of research areas show that philosophers do not take these non-cognitive functions into account when discussing these several issues in neuroscientific research. Now, I think we can overcome cognitive myopia, and I'm going to claim that we can do this by adopting a patchwork approach to the concept of neural function. And this patchwork approach holds that the concept of neural function consists of several patches or segments, so it has a heterogeneous internal structure, and that these patches describe different kinds of neural functions. So the move away from cognitive myopia is to acknowledge or reconsider cognitive functions as describing only one patch or being situated only on one patch of the concept of neural function. And because cognitive myopia equates that with the entire concept of neural functions, it leads to an erroneous semantic picture of neural function, of the concept of neural function. And we can overcome this picture. Oh, sorry, I should first say that I'm going to assume that these cognitive patches, or here I'm just going to talk about one, refer to mechanisms that process behaviorally relevant information, and that we should add to these cognitive patches non-cognitive patches, of which I will discuss two in the following, which refer to mechanisms that maintain or repair neural or other systems of the body. By adopting this patchwork approach, or by giving these working definitions of cognitive and non-cognitive patches of functions, I do not claim to give a positive definition of what cognition is, which is, as you may know, a perennial problem in philosophy and of mind and cognitive science, to say exactly what cognition is positively. Instead of doing that, I want to just use a sort of interesting general difference in the causal specificity to characterize these different kinds of functions. So to understand causal specificity, Consider a radio. So this is an analogy introduced by James Woodward. And the radio has different buttons. It has a frequency knob. And this frequency knob, if we turn it, has a causally specific effect on the output of the radio, because turning it will change which frequency the radio transmits. And in contrast to that, the on-off button will have a relatively unspecific or non-specific effect on the radio, because it will just simply shut all system outputs on or off. And what I'm going to claim in this talk is that cognitive functions, in the ideal case, work like these frequency knobs in the radio. They have causally specific effects on cognition and behavior, and this is evidence for them being operative conditions in cognition and behavior. And this notion of operative in is from an old paper on memory by Martin and Deutscher, who specified as a third condition between besides being necessary or being sufficient. And they don't give a full analysis of what operative in means, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to assume that operative in cognition means that an entity or activity, a set of entity or activities brings about the behavioral change of the cognitive system when it works as it does in context that neuroscientists are interested in. And I will explain later on what I mean exactly by that. In contrast to these operative conditions, and I should say, so I take causally specific effects as evidence for entities and activities to be operative in cognition and behavior. I don't think that those define what operative in means, but they are evidence for being operative in. And in contrast to that, non-cognitive functions in the ideal case are more like the on-off button of the radio. They have causally non-specific effects on cognition and behavior. You have to keep it relative to cognition and behavior to make this comparison. And so they will oftentimes simply shut cognitive mechanisms on or off, or many cognitive manipulations of cognitive mechanisms will have the same effect on a non-cognitive mechanism. And again, these causally non-specific effects are evidence for these functions being enabling conditions rather than operative conditions in cognition and behavior. And in the following, I'm now going to use this notion of causal specificity to look at some examples of neural function at the mesoscale of neural circuits, which are usually modeled in a way as here shown on the left, so by certain circuit diagrams. I'm going to follow the causal role view of function in philosophy of science by claiming that circuit functions are simply the causal roles that neural populations that can range from a few hundred to about 10,000 cells contribute to some containing system. So that could be the entire organism or some subsystem of the organism, as we'll see in the following. And so if we apply this notion of causal specificity, we should see that, we should find that if there are cognitive and non-cognitive functions at this mesoscale of neural circuits, they will vary in their causal specificity in cognition and behavior. And by giving examples of these kinds of functions, I will try to show that these repair and maintenance functions constrain information processing, so cognitive function, at the same scale. So the point is not to say that somehow cognitive explanation bottoms out in some sort of non-cognitive level, but rather that these exist at the same scale, and that non-cognitive functions constrain which kinds of information processing a neural system can execute. All right, So now I will start by looking at a clear example of a function that is situated on this cognitive patch of the concept of neural function. And this example will be the role of circuits in the frontal eye field here below, marked in orange, roughly. Of course, it's only schematic. And in eye control. So the frontal eye fields receive inputs from, besides many others, from the primary visual cortex, and they take these inputs to encode. So the neurons in the layer 4 of the frontal eye field take these inputs to encode a visual salience map by decoding the strongest retinotopic position in the visual field. And by doing that and sending that map to output neurons in layer 5, they control the movement of the eyes of the organism to the stimulus that is salient to the animal. And if we now manipulate that mechanism by, for instance, changing the input, we will change the visual salience map and thereby change where the eyes of the organism will move next. Or we can also manipulate the activity of the frontal eye fields itself and again change where it will look at. And these are causally specific effects on eye control and thereby evidence for the claim that the frontal eye field circuits are operative in eye control. In contrast, functions that I will call subsistence functions do not process such behaviorally relevant information about the environment, but maintain the life of the organism. And examples of such subsistence functions are breathing, digestion, or circulation, and basic movement capacities. And an example of such a function, how it's implemented, is the role of the medulla oblongata in the brainstem in the control of breathing. So the medulla oblongata contains a central pattern generator circuit that produces a rhythm, a motor rhythm, that is used to control the inhalation of oxygen and the exhalation of CO2. And this is being forwarded to the lungs to control this movement. And if we now manipulate that circuit, we get a relatively non-specific effect on cognition of behavior, because disrupting the breathing rhythm will result in dizziness, confusion, or even loss of consciousness, which indirectly interferes with many different cognitive capacities of the organism. Conversely, if we manipulate one specific cognitive function, this might map to the same sort of normal breathing rhythm, given that many cognitive functions might not, so think about different types of perception, might not be physically taxing enough to change a lot about the breathing rhythm. So in that sense, it's also unspecific. These functions are non-cognitive because the central pattern generators, which are composed of pacemakers, so those are populations of cells that can fire by themselves through to intrinsic membrane oscillations, and followers, which are being entrained by the rhythm and then inhibit the pacemakers. So this sort of arrangement can produce a motor rhythm, the so-called central pattern, so without sensory inputs. So what is usually just required is some sort of internal neuromodulators to keep these circuits going. But if the sensory inputs are not there, this rhythm can still be generated. And so sensory input seems not to be necessary for rhythm generation. And therefore, we could argue that these cells do not encode sensory information. Although they are, of course, modified in their working by sensory feedback, that sensory feedback is not necessary for rhythm generation. And because these outputs of these generators are subsistence functions, that maintain the body in some sort of state where it can continue to exist. These functions enable but are not operative in any specific cognitive function that they so enable. All right. Lastly, infrastructural functions are also maintenance and repair functions, but they, rather than maintaining the life of the organism or being connected to some other system in the body, they prevent damage in the neural system itself, in these neural circuits that they are that execute them. And because preventing damage is sort of necessary for information processing to run smoothly, this is not dependent on any specific kind of information processing, but is invariantly executed across different tasks. And the example that I'm going to use here is the example of gain control to prevent overexcitation in a circuit. So here on the left, we see what's being called a canonical microcircuit, which consists of the model that consists of two excitatory populations in the deep and superficial layers and one inhibitory populations. And when there is input from the senses or from some other cortical area, there will be a circuit interaction here between these inhibitory and excitatory elements, which will over time result in an oscillation, often in the gamma frequency range. And this oscillation, because it's a result of this interaction of the circuit elements, indicates how active the circuit is, but it can also be used in sort of different cognitive outputs. So for instance, it might be that the circuit processes information about this flower or about this kitten, and but this is for now irrelevant to sort of the infrastructural function, because this oscillation can be used as a negative feedback for another cell population of inhibitory chandelier cells. And these inhibitory chandelier cells are different from these other inhibitory cells because they connect only to the axon hillocks of excitatory pyramidal cells. And so they can act directly on that locus where these cells generate action potentials. And they can do that in three kind of different states. So in low firing rates, they will provide a window of excitation, so they will enable further excitation. In intermediate firing rates and in the presence of gamma oscillations, they will act as divisive gain controllers, so they will change the firing rate by a divisive factor. And in high rates, when the other inhibitory cells will be unable to stop further firing, they will act as subtractive inhibitors to prevent further firing. And this is important because if we manipulate the activity of chandelier cells, we get again a causally non-specific effect on cognition and behavior, because now the system will not be able to prevent overexcitation, and this will lead, for instance, to epileptic seizures. So we cannot have normal information processing, but instead have epileptic seizures. And there's some evidence that in epileptic patients, these chandelier cells are missing. All right, so these functions can also be construed as non-cognitive because this infrastructural functions of gain control is, again, as I said before, independent of which kind of information is being processed in these other elements. What matters is the activity level. That's what matters to these chandelier cells, not which information is being processed. And if we would now recompose this infrastructural function with the cognitive function such a circuit can contribute to, we can see that this gain control constrains exactly which firing rates the circuit can use to implement information processing. The firing rates are too high, the chandelier cell will act as a subtractive inhibitor and therefore not allow, so to say, the forwarding of information. And that's sort of the idea that gamma oscillations have a feed-forward role to aid information processing, and that's being constrained by gain control. Okay, so far I've argued that at the mesoscale, we find that the concept of neural function has a heterogeneous structure that refers to different kinds of circuit functions. Cognitive concepts only describe operative but not enabling conditions for cognition and behavior, and therefore cognitive myopia, which only focuses on cognitive functions, fails to capture this full plethora of mesoscale functions. And now I'm going to argue that if we use a patchwork approach, we can overcome cognitive myopia. So why should we adopt such an approach? First, we might think that this sort of heterogeneous structure is sort of bad and the concept is somehow deficient, but instead the patchwork approach says that, or argues that, this is not a defect but a sign of linguistic efficiency. If it is such the case that we have different kinds of mechanisms, we need this sort of heterogeneous structure to capture that heterogeneity. And it's also not the case that there's simply that these examples that I just gave suggest that any kind of causal relationship counts as an instance of neural function, but rather that neural function refers to different kinds of mechanistic organization of entities and activities in the central nervous system. So it's a better way of dealing with the problem than deflating the concept of neural function. And finally, what the patchwork approach positively helps to do is to understand how specifically neural systems maintain and repair themselves, not just any biological systems, but neural systems with specific components such as chandelier cells or central pattern generators. So the patchwork model of neural function that I am going to explain to you now posits that the concept of neural function has local reference. So this is in contradistinction to essentialist approaches that would posit a universal reference relationship. But here we see that the concept refers to different types of circuit elements with different types of roles, operative or enabling roles in cognition and behavior. Secondly, the patchwork approach looks at different kinds of patches and their relationships. So we can identify relationships between the patches to sort of say how they relate to one another. So I'm going to use both mechanistic and evolutionary relations to characterize these how these patches are linked to one another or are related to one another. And I should also say that here in the diagram actually should also be an overlap here. I let these overlap because I use this notion of causal specificity and not some mark of the cognitive to distinguish different kinds of functions. So there could be in-between cases, borderline cases, where functions sort of share features of both patches, or can be described by using features of both patches. Finally, the meaning of these patches is not derived from some sort of unified theory of neural function, but instead from local experimental conditions to apply these circuit concepts to the brain. And here in my dissertation, I extensively rely on the work from Jackie Sullivan and Oriana Fes to describe or defend this claim that experimental conditions can serve as application conditions of concepts in the absence of a global theory. So let's look at these relationships in a bit more detail. I will start with the mechanistic relationships between these different kinds of functions. So I claim that infrastructural functions are coupled to cognitive functions. Sorry, can you say this? Coupled to infrastructural functions because we need the cognitive inputs to get, for instance, this gain controlling pathway going. In contrast to that, I argued that subsistence functions are decoupled from cognitive functions because they can generate these outputs in the absence of sensory inputs or even in the absence of mechanisms, cognitive mechanisms. So this is how we can distinguish different types of cognitive functions from one another by looking at their mechanistic relation to cognitive functions. And if we consider the evolution of the central nervous system, we can see that if we move from subsistence functions to infrastructural functions, we get a sort of internalization where functions that are formerly used to maintain external systems, such as the lungs or respiratory systems, are now used to maintain systems of the brain itself, but the underlying architecture might be to a certain extent similar. Whereas if we move from subsistence functions to cognitive functions, so when the evolving system develops these information processing functions, we get an acceptation because a formerly non-cognitive circuit now assumes a cognitive function. And I think that this patchwork approach overcomes cognitive myopia because it first helps us to evaluate more clearly circuit research in neuroscience. So consider, for instance, this recent review by Juste et al., where they argue that if there are these central pattern generators also in the cortex, so usually they are found in the brainstem or in the spinal cord, they may subserve learning or memory functions. And of course, this is one possibility, but again, because they are sort of somewhat cognitively myopic, they overlook that it might also be the case that these central pattern generators in the cortex, if they exist, subserve infrastructural functions so that they prevent circuit damage. And also this paper sort of lumps these different evolutionary processes together under the label encephalization. And I would argue that the patchwork approach sort of deals better with sort of the evolution here because it will distinguish encephalization from acceptation of neural function. And also, final note, I view these patchwork models as conceptual resources to use or extend or revise during research. So it's not like there's some sort of static model, so they should be used in ongoing research and see whether they can lead further investigation. Finally, also, if we look at topics in philosophy of neuroscience, the patchwork approach helps to overcome cognitive myopia. So I mentioned this issue of multifunctionality before. And oh, now I figured this out. Well, way too late. Sorry. There have been several approaches here in the literature. One is that if we have multifunctionality of neural structures, we should replace these cognitive concepts with, for instance, computational concepts. And the patchwork approach has an alternative here because it says that if you have different types of functions, you can work on different kinds of patches. And this might help researchers more than just replacing one concept with the other. And the point here being that we see that the brain is not only cognitively multifunctional, but also can have, a system can have both a cognitive function or a non-cognitive function, or can have multiple non-cognitive functions. So some central pattern generators can have different output rhythms for different subsistence functions, or cortical microcircuits can have a cognitive functions or multiple cognitive functions, and they have to have non-cognitive functions that prevent this damage. And these options are not characterized by these approaches in philosophy of neuroscience so far. And this is also seen if we look at these mechanistic organization approaches by, for instance, McCaffrey, who tries to give a typology of different kinds of mechanistic organization of multifunctional structures. But this typology does not capture this kind of coupling or decoupling that I talked about of cognitive and non-cognitive functions. So here we have also need to expand the existing accounts. And finally, there has also been these contextualist accounts, such as by Dan Bernstein. And here, usually the focus is on how non-cognitive functions of neural systems change with perceptual context. And these examples that I presented here show, in addition, that these non-cognitive functions change with biochemicals or neuromodulatory or circuit contexts, where circuit parameters change, and these are sort of additional contexts to the perceptual context that might cross-classify each other. So in some, so this is just sort of an outlook here, but what I think can be shown is that this problem of multifunctionality is both more pervasive and more diverse than these cognitively myopic accounts suggest, that just focus on multiple cognitive functions. All right, so to wrap up, if we want to meet the brain on its own terms, I argued that we should adopt a patchwork approach that views the brain not only as an information processing machine, but also as a physiological apparatus that maintains and repairs itself. And while I've mostly talked about these enabling, or exclusively talked about these enabling and operative conditions here, in further research, I aim to show, I also have begun to show that there are these sort of modulatory functions that have a causal specificity between enabling and operative conditions. So consider, for instance, physiological arousal. Physiological arousal has a graded effect on behavior, but it's not specific to any sort of task. It affects many different kinds of cognitive tasks at once. So it has this sort of intermediate causal specificity. So here we see that there's a spectrum from enabling to operative conditions, rather than a sharp distinction. And also, what I haven't talked about here, but what I think is really important to this patchwork approach, is that we can use exploratory experiments to form new functional concepts. And in fact, these sort of circuit concepts that I talked about today have been formed by these exploratory experiments. And that's sort of like an additional topic that I worked on in my dissertation. And I think I'm going to stop here and thank you for your attention, and my supervisors of my dissertation, and all the neuroscientists and philosophers who helped progress or help discuss in discussing this research. All right, I'm now gonna stop share my screen, and I hope we can start with the discussion.